Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar from Delta.ee on remote boiler diagnostics. We are very excited to talk to you today about the highlights of our research on this topic. With myself, Arthur Joannick, I have my colleagues Evita and Matti around here today. Good morning, Evita. Good morning, Matti.
Hi everyone.
Good morning, everyone.
Today's webinar, as I said, will focus on the topic of remote boiler diagnostics or connected maintenance or heating diagnostics. There are lots of ways we can call this topic, but we have decided to focus on the topic of remote boiler, specifically diagnostics. And the main question we have been asked by our clients is what's really happening and is it worth investing in this market? So we will try to answer these questions in the webinar, but obviously it's not the only questions that are still being asked in the market. The webinar is recorded, so everything will be made available later on YouTube. The slides can be made available as well, so don't worry if you don't have time to follow everything. You can watch it or look at the slides again later on. Just to introduce ourselves here today, so it's myself on the top left, Arthur here, with my colleagues Matti and Evita. On the topic of remote boiler diagnostics, we have had quite a big team working on this. Our colleagues Maria, Neil, and Mikkel have also joined the research. And we have had also our heat analyst colleagues who have been helping us as well, understanding how the boiler market is evolving. Just to tell you a bit how the software works, if you're not familiar with it. So this should be what you are looking at right now. You can ask questions to us directly. We are monitoring every question. We will either answer them by typing something, or we can also open the discussion with these questions. So at the end of the webinar, we will leave around 10-15 minutes just for questions. But if we see an interesting one, we might just interrupt the discussion and try to answer the question. So feel free to ask as many as possible. If we don't have time to answer your question, we will follow up with you after the webinar. Brief introduction to Delta for those who don't know us. We really exist to help companies navigate the transition from old to new energy. You can see on the slide here the different topics we focus on. The main two areas which we're interested in today are the heating markets, specifically around low carbon heating, and digital energy, and particularly the IoT and the connected home. The highlights of the research we are sharing with you today are coming directly from these services. And particularly, there is a report now available on our connected home service, which comes on the right-hand side, the digital energy research. Just again to show what we do, we provide two main work subscription research services on all the topics around this, but also consultancy or strategy advice, again, around these topics to help you navigate the transition as well as possible. Briefly, again, the main ways we support people in organizations are anywhere from the innovation, the planning, the R&D, down to the product management, the day-to-day job of focusing on new energy. For the connected home topic, that might be controls, heating controls product manager, or someone in the utility responsible for selling energy supply contract with products. So anything really related to this. And finally, these are the kinds of companies we work for, mostly energy companies or technology manufacturers, and a little bit around policy shapers, investors, associations, etc. So if you want to know more about what we do, feel free to let us know after the webinar and we can have a discussion about this. But enough about us, and here will be the discussion for today. So obviously a little bit of introduction on the topic of remote boiler diagnostics. We have heard a lot of definitions and ways to think about it, but we have decided to kind of gather all of this and make one definition for the market. We will look at some of the key players active in the market, from the utilities, the boiler OEMs, the service providers, etc. We will look a little bit at how we can make money from boiler diagnostics, particularly around direct monetization, but also all the soft factors linked to this. We will talk about our views on the future of this market, where we see that going, where we see companies moving, how we see customers thinking about this. And as I said, we will leave around 10, 15 minutes for Q&As, but again, feel free to ask questions through the webinar. We see a lot of questions already being asked. That's great. We're already answering some by typing, but we will interrupt the webinar if needed. And I will hand over now to Evita to talk about definitions about this market.
Thanks a lot, Arthur. So yes, first of all, we're going to start with a few definitions on this topic. And we're going to start with talking a bit about setting the context between what we think is the difference between a connectable and connected boiler. And the reason for that is because we have heard a lot of things around the market about connectability and connectivity, and this is a key difference for remote boiler diagnostics. So we define a connectable boiler being a boiler that could be retrofitted with additional hardware that could allow transmission of data, and that data could be system performance data or error codes. Compared to that, a connected boiler is a boiler that already has connectivity, either built-in or retrofit, and allows transmission of data. So for remote boiler diagnostics, we need a connected boiler, and that which can allow to be remotely monitored and to transmit, as we said, system performance data and error codes. A connected boiler being used for remote boiler diagnostics can alert either the user or the installer or the service provider on the other end about any faults that are happening, and give actionable insights in that sense, which can depend on the level of the detail of the data that is being given, and it can vary from either simple error codes up to until identifying which is the specific part that is malfunctioning and identify the specific part that needs to be changed in the boiler. So in our research, we have, as Arthur has also said, we have focused on gas boilers for residential properties, and we have focused on the big gas boiler markets around Europe, which are shown in the slide on the bottom right, these being UK, Germany, France, Netherlands, Italy, Belgium, and Spain. All these markets cover over 85% of the installed base of gas boilers, and this is where we see most of the activity for remote boiler diagnostics, so it made sense for us to focus in this area. So in the next slide, we are going to discuss the approaches for remote boiler diagnostics, both from a hardware point of view, but also a software point of view. In the next slide. So first of all, in terms of the hardware, we have identified 4 main hardware approaches for connecting a boiler, and most of them actually require a gateway for each boiler to connect to the internet. For the first 2 approaches, the primary target market is private homeowners, and these are the most common approaches that we have seen in the market so far. For the first one, it requires a communication model, which is then connected to a gateway, which allows transmitting the data to the cloud. This is an approach that we have seen being taken mostly by boiler manufacturers that develop solutions for their own boiler brands. The second one, which is also one of the most common approaches in the market at the moment, requires a smart thermostat. A smart thermostat, and again, a gateway, a dedicated gateway for each boiler to connect to the internet. This is an approach that we have seen being taken again by boiler manufacturers using their own brands of smart thermostats, but it's also an approach that's being taken by controls manufacturers and smart thermostat manufacturers. The next 2 approaches have as a primary target market social housing or large residential property managers. So these are mainly B2B solutions for remote diagnostics, and both of them are quite niche in the market at the moment. So in the third approach, we have a communication model for each boiler, but with no need for a dedicated gateway. So in this case, we have a boiler which through a communication model allows for direct transmission of data from the boiler to the cloud. This is quite a niche application, and we have seen a few HVAC manufacturers being trialing this solution. The last one, which is quite interesting, is where we have multiple boilers connected through their separate smart thermostat or communication model, but all of them using one central single gateway to connect to the cloud. This is quite interesting and niche application used, as I said, for social housing properties. But it's quite interesting because it doesn't rely on each home's Wi-Fi, and it just needs one single gateway to connect the cloud. So in the next slide, Matti is going to talk a bit about the software approaches for remote diagnostics.
And just as a clarification on one question as well, the dedicated gateway will be usually a separate device from the router. So in the market today, that would basically mean that there's an additional white box in between the homeowner's router and the boiler communications. So of course the hardware is only, well, it's not really even half the side. It's probably even a bit less than that. A lot of the key parts happens around software side, around the protocols. For extracting data from the boiler, we've identified two established and two kind of more alternative approaches. Of the two established approaches, the one is around using proprietary boiler OEM protocols. So this would be each of the large boiler manufacturers having their own protocol and only working with their own boiler. So this offers low boiler compatibility, really with only that specific brand. But of course, the level of insight can be very high, and some of the larger boiler manufacturers, they will be getting hundreds of data points, well over 100 data points from the boiler. Then another established approach is using the OpenTherm protocol, and which is quite common in some markets, but overall its penetration is fairly low in Europe. So this would be a big penetration in the Netherlands, for instance. This will allow for much wider boiler compatibility, so any boiler really using the standard OpenTherm protocol. Of course, the level of insight you can gather from that is a bit more limited, and of course there's also much more complicated issues around, for instance, how the OpenTherm standard has been implemented in each boiler, so this data consistency can be a problem. So while it's in theory an open standard, there is still a lot of work to be done to actually analyze those insights you get from that. And then when we talk about the alternative approaches, one of the kind of more talked about is around something primarily Tado has been driving forward, which is hacking the boiler protocol or reverse engineering it. So in theory, this could mean that there's very wide boiler compatibility, that you could access all the boiler brands that you've managed to hack, which, for instance, Tado claims is most of the European stock. And of course, in theory, the level of insights could be the same as the boiler OEMs, but there's so much work having to go in to reverse engineering, understanding exactly what's going on in the boiler, that in reality, this is probably quite not true yet. So likely the insights on average are going to be a bit lower than the other approaches.
There's a question on the percentage of each approaches in the market today and whether OpenTherm is sufficient for remote diagnostics. Well, it's a really hard question to answer right now because we're early days in the market. Let's say that the boiler manufacturers are all capable of gathering their own data from their own boilers. So in that sense, it's quite high penetration. As Matti explained, OpenTherm is mostly well established in the Netherlands, with over 80 or 90% of the boilers being capable of extracting data. But even in these cases, the OpenTherm protocol isn't really ideal for extracting data points for diagnostics. So again, the percentage of each approach right now is hard to define, but we suspect later on in the market in the next few years we will see some that will be more advanced than others.
And to follow up, there's another question around why is the level of insights more limited from OpenTherm, and that is largely because OpenTherm is a standardized, so there's a more limited number of data points you get from the boiler. But also a big problem is that the implementation of OpenTherm can vary a lot from one boiler to another. So it's often still requires quite a lot of work for each boiler brand to really be able to drive those insights and the actionable insights from the boiler. So there's a lot of reasons around why OpenTherm might not be the ideal solution. And even in the Netherlands, we're seeing a lot of activity without using OpenTherm for remote boiler diagnostics, even though OpenTherm is really common in the market. So, and then finally, to wrap up the approaches, the last alternative approach we've seen is around using external sensors. So primarily using sensors around some of the plumbing. So for instance, monitoring the flow temperature and the return temperature of the water. So these are solutions which only have external sensors really. So they're not getting any information about the inside workings of the boiler. So only external information. And of course, the idea here is that these could work with any boiler in the market and offer really high compatibility. But of course, the level of insights will be much lower. But there could be a case for this type of solution in some applications. And we'll discuss that a bit later. So these are some of the hardware approaches, some of the kind of software approaches we identified. So what does the market look like in terms of activity from key players? If you look at the top, we have the 4 hardware approaches we identified. And then on the left, we have some of the key types of companies. And if you look at the HVAC manufacturers, they will be active across all of these approaches. Most of the activity will be using dedicated communications modules or using their smart thermostats, which all of these companies will already be providing. So that's most of the activity. We see some activity specifically in the Netherlands around using the 3rd and 4th approach, which are more focused on larger properties, social housing, and these type of applications. And these are actually quite interesting. Actually, we think there's quite a big market potential there, and really the Netherlands is a really interesting case study to look into how this side of the market is going to develop outside the private homeowners. Unsurprisingly, the controls manufacturers are primarily using the smart thermostats as their route into the boiler data. But when we look at the kind of the large maintenance providers, it's also quite unsurprising in a way that they're doing what most of the activities, because they're largely dependent on what the controls companies and what the HVAC manufacturers do in the solutions. So they're using either usually the communications modules on the boilers or even more commonly the smart thermostat. And then when we look at some of the other challenges out there, there's quite a wide range of activity, but the smart thermostat is really the focal point for these startups, because it's, in a way, for them, most of them have this product. And remote boiler diagnostics, another potential revenue stream, another way of commercializing their product, potentially in a more B2B way rather than B2C.
There is the question on the hacking model that Tado is using. Does the hacking option invalidate any customer warranty? I think that's a really good question, and that's something that I guess boiler manufacturers will look into in the future. I can't see any example right now, Matty, correct me if I'm wrong, of boiler manufacturers invalidating warranties if using some sort of hacking thermostat. However, we know that some boiler manufacturers extend the warranties sometimes if using their own smart thermostats rather than a third-party thermostat. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think currently the boiler OEMs are you can think of it as a carrot and a stick. The carrot, what they're using currently is that if you get their smart thermostat, they'll extend the warranty. So they kind of try and incentivize the customer to take their smart thermostat. If someone like Tado, for instance, would have great success, maybe they'll bring out the stick and say, if you use a Tado, we'll void the warranty or shorten it or whatever that may be. So in a way, I think partly the boiler manufacturers yet don't have a need for this kind of very aggressive strategy, because it could also potentially upset customers who, let's say, want to have a Tado smart thermostat or already have a Tado. So, yeah.
There is a question on the commercial models behind each of these examples. For example, what benefits will customers see and be prepared to pay for? Well, actually, that's the questions we are going to answer in the next part of this webinar. So this is coming up.
To move along, the key users of remote diagnostics. On the last slide, we showed a lot of the solution providers, the different types of companies, but the key users kind of are really the service providers. So that's the large installation and maintenance companies, some independent installers, and also companies more focused on facilities management for instance, on social housing. And then, of course, at the end of it, there's an end user. So you can think of this as a really typical B2B to C market. For the purposes of our webinar today, we'll really be focusing on the service provider because they're really the key piece for this market emerging. So much of the discussion will focus around here. Of course, we've covered and in the research looked at the whole chain. But today's webinar, can also in interest of time, will focus primarily on the service providers and also touch, of course, on the other areas.
So to set a bit of the context, we're going to describe the boiler servicing market in each country. And in this exercise, we've looked a bit on the market penetration of servicing contracts in each country, as well as which are the key players, the key companies active in each market. So in terms of what's the market penetration of servicing contracts, Netherlands is the top country in that it has almost 50% of its households having a boiler servicing contract. And Netherlands is followed by the UK and Spain with also quite high penetration, then followed by France. And last but not least, it's Italy, Belgium, and Germany, where servicing contracts are not quite popular with private homeowners, but they are still growing markets. What stands out in terms of the players in the market is that there are only a few big nationwide players in each country, and in most of them, these are led by energy suppliers. So most of the servicing contracts in the countries are held by energy suppliers or their servicing partners. An example of that is, of course, in the UK, British Gas, which is the largest service provider. In Spain, we've got most servicing contracts held by Naturgy or Iberdrola. But even in smaller servicing markets like Italy, we have a big player being Assistenza Casa, which is partly owned by Edison. Another point to make for the boiler servicing market in Europe is that we see a few players like HomeServe operating in more than one countries. So the example of HomeServe, which is quite big in the UK, but it's also operating, as I said, in Italy, but also France and Spain.
Evita, we have a quick question on where are our sources for the data points we are showing here. We're actually, through the research we do at Delta, and in the last years, we have been talking to all these companies for our research subscription purposes, for consulting work purposes. So we have a very good relationship with them. And these data points are actually not that confidential country-wise. So we have just been gathering a lot of data through the years, and this is a kind of summary of what we could do. Another point to show here is that actually remote diagnostics for these companies is not necessarily a way of stealing customers from other companies, but we can see here that the penetration of services is quite small technically from the penetration of gas boilers. And most of the companies believe that they can actually increase the number of customers that get a boiler service contract from them. So actually the remote diagnostics market could potentially also help grow the boiler servicing market.
So next we're going to describe one commercially active proposition that is out there at the moment, and we have chosen to show the proposition from Feenstra, which is active in the Netherlands. So as a background, Feenstra is one of the largest install and maintenance providers in the Netherlands. It has almost 800,000 customers in the Netherlands, and it is owned by energy supplier Nuon. So for remote boiler diagnostics, Feenstra is focusing mainly on its rental portfolio. It has actually made remote diagnostics be a default for their rental boilers. So the customers that get a rental boiler package, they get with it a smart thermostat for free and a full repair and maintenance contract with Feenstra. And all boilers are by default remotely monitored by Feenstra. At the moment, the majority of rental boilers that are being monitored by Feenstra are with Intercast. But of course, Feenstra is working with multiple boiler OEMs as well as control manufacturers like Honeywell in order to develop a very wide and extensive platform where it can gather data from many boiler APIs. So Feenstra is one of the case studies that we look for the report, but we have also looked at examples of commercially active propositions in the UK with British Gas Boiler IQ proposition and the new remote diagnostics boiler financing proposition from NG Home Services in France.
Just a quick word on this, since it's the latest, let's say, arrival into the market. So NG is now offering to customers to pay something around 60 plus euros per month for 5 years to get an NG branded boiler, which is quite new actually. And in addition to this, you get a smart thermostat that's enabling the remote diagnostics part of the service. And the goal is to provide the monitoring, the maintenance, and the repair service within that contract. So we see interesting propositions, different propositions coming into the market. And we believe that this will continue to be a trend in the market. So how to differentiate your offer for boiler installation, for boiler servicing, all including remote monitoring for remote diagnostics.
Okay, so now we've set a lot of the scene around the approaches being taken to remote diagnostics and also what the kind of market is looking at, both from the activities from the players and also the boiler servicing market around our maintenance contracts. So then the question, which is also very much in the title of the webinar, is how do we make money out of remote diagnostics? Basically, where's the money? To answer this question, I first want to kind of describe what the kind of typical customer journey is for a boiler breakdown. So initially for a customer, there's always going to be, before the failure even happens, there's usually some issues that start emerging. For instance, the boiler pressure might start going down, and this will eventually lead to a boiler failure. But for a customer, usually in a typical situation, it will take some time for them to notice it. I think British Gas has quoted a figure that it takes usually around 18 hours or something along those lines for a customer to notice. But of course, this makes perfect sense. You know, if your boiler breaks down at night, you're not going to notice until next morning, or if you don't notice in the morning, you're going to notice it when you come back home from work. So there's a bit of a delay there. So then usually after this, you know, you book a visit, you get a service engineer to come and check your boiler, and hopefully the boiler is fixed on the first visit. It's not a complicated problem and the engineer fixes it. If not, then the engineer might have to order new parts or go back for special tools or anything along those lines. And then the boiler might get fixed on later visits. So typically the boiler fix, if everything goes well, you know, it's 1 or 2 days that you get your boiler fixed. But often this process can also drag on a lot longer as well. So that's kind of the regular, let's say, analog process of the customer journey. Then if we add remote boiler diagnostics to this kind of customer journey, first, before the failure happens, there's already data being collected on the boiler performance, and the service provider knows what's going on with the boiler. So when the boiler fails, the service provider will immediately notify the customer, typically, and it will then, when it's notified the customer, it will also take the best action. Sometimes the best action would be that they just call the customer and say, actually, the problem with your boiler is very simple and you could fix it yourself. Are you happy for us to run you through this? So basically, all that is needed to fix the boiler is the customer to be home. You know, it could be 10, 15 minutes on the phone with a customer service agent and the boiler's fixed. So of course, for a customer, that's quite a nice customer experience if you get it fixed immediately. So these could be issues around, let's say, water pressure or things like that. And if it's not possible to fix it over the phone, then the service provider will book an engineer visit. Often they will also know or have an indication of what's the likely cause of the problem. So they might make sure the right parts are with the installer, and also they can, having knowledge of the boiler failures, they can also help to optimize their workforce and the timings of when they will do the visit, how long it will likely take to fix the boiler. So all kind of information that can improve the customer experience. And once the engineers carry out the visit, they hopefully get it fixed on the first go. And of course, that's the big difference here, that they're more likely to be able to fix the boiler on the first visit because they had already information beforehand on what's likely going to be wrong with the boiler. And of course, it proves out to be a more complicated visit problem, then additional visits might be needed. So as you can see, in a way, in orange there on the right, we have kind of the situation when the boiler gets fixed. These get pushed back earlier in time. So in a way, this will, for a customer, using remote diagnostics will lead to the problem to be resolved quicker. And when we look at British Gas, who's been really kind of pushing the early market for remote boiler diagnostics, they reported that with remote diagnostics, the Boiler IQ proposition, they can reduce the number of first-time visits or the visits required by 7% just by sorting out things over the phone or sorting things beforehand. When it comes to, for the engineer visits, they reported a 20% reduction in the second visits required, so they can get more of the boiler simply fixed on the first time. And these are really the key operational savings points for service providers. So this is where you can directly see the value of remote boiler diagnostics.
Just a quick story. I just attended a conference in France called Be Positive last week, and I was in a panel talking with a heat pump manufacturer who is doing remote diagnostics for heat pumps. One of the things that person talked about is, for example, simple things like a temperature sensor. When temperature sensors start to not work properly, there is apparently some sort of electrical frequency that you can detect in this, and you can basically anticipate the failure of the sensor, which means you can start to do some sort of preventive maintenance already. For example, when the plumber is thinking about his next maintenance visit, the plumber can actually bring the right part to change and replace it before it fails. And that's where we start to see some sort of preventive maintenance rather than simple remote diagnostics. So that's one interesting example.
Yeah, there was also a question so it's not preventing boiler failures not possible? It is possible, but in a way what we described here is, well, one of the questions in the webinar, what's really going on in the market? And the reality is that we are not at the point in the market where predictive maintenance or preventing failures is really happening in the market. So what we're describing here is what companies are actually doing in the market. Of course, in the future, some of these issues, boiler failures, might be prevented altogether. Some of this is happening, but it is in fairly simple around, for instance, let's say the pressure issues. They might spot that already and let the customer know that this is happening. So could you please fix this? So this is also a way to avoid those visits as well. So it doesn't always lead to boiler failure, but reality is that the predictive maintenance is very niche at the moment. So also, what is the actual concrete monetary value? I now described some of the ways how this value could come from. At Delta, we did a fair bit of modeling around looking what could the monetary amount, could remote diagnostic make sense as an investment? So we, of course, had to consider a lot of factors. We looked at loads of different variables and assumptions related to the boiler servicing. So, for instance, what's the average cost of an engineer visit? How many boilers under a maintenance contract will have an annual visit in any given year, an unplanned one, the average customer lifetime of contracts, all sorts of things. And with these assumptions in our base case, so these are kind of assumptions that we think are the realistic and what's actually descriptive of the market, we estimated that we could get a 15% cost reduction in engineer visits for under a boiler maintenance contract. And we also analyzed several different ways of how this could be, what the proposition could be. So if there is, on the top one, there's no fee to the customer, it's all basically subsidized by the service provider. In this case, on the left-hand side, you'll see the payback period, which is, in this case, it's over 15 years. So that basically is the lifetime of a boiler, or in some cases even a bit more. So no real payback. And then on the right-hand side, we have a net present value of this investment at a per boiler level. So basically over a lifetime, this would mean that the boiler the investment would directly lose money, is the short answer. So how does this picture change if the customer is charged €1 a month? Well, then the payback period for the remote boiler diagnostics, it moves to around 7 years, which still is not quite enough. If you think of a typical customer lifetime of a service maintenance contract, then this probably isn't sufficient to make a return. Of course, there could be additional consideration. What if remote boiler diagnostics increases the lifetime of a service maintenance contract customer? So there's loads of variables, but when we start charging around €2 a month, then the payback starts going around 4 years. And at this point, in our base assumptions, this would already be a profitable investment with a discount rate of 10%. And of course, if you start charging €3 a month and also charge for the hardware for the customer, the returns, of course, can be very significant. But then again, this raises the question, okay, if at purely looking at the savings we make, then we need to charge the customer. Are the customers actually willing to pay anything for this? And luckily, we also did some European customer research, specifically with homeowners. And of these homeowners, we covered 5 countries, so the UK, Netherlands, Italy, Germany, and France. And all of these people were homeowners. 56% stated they were willing to pay something for a proposition like this. And then 33% said they were not willing, and then there was 10% who kind of didn't know if they would be willing or not. And when we look at the average amount, this is around €2 per month across all these countries. There's a fair bit of variation between the countries, but this would fall nicely into what you could already make a return on, just purely based on the cost savings on the repairs. Of course, we also analysed in our research all the other kind of soft factors that go behind this. So why would customers adopt boiler diagnostics? But in the interest of time, we didn't have time to go into this in this webinar. And also on the customer research, we did look at loads of other factors, such as what are the main drivers for people wanting remote boiler diagnostics, who would their preferred supplier be, appeal of bundling this with the maintenance contract, for instance, and all sorts of other things. But basically, the message seems to be that there is at least some willingness to pay for remote boiler diagnostics, and the proposition is to at least some degree attractive to customers.
And just to answer some of the questions we have been asking, we went very quickly through the slide. There is some reading to do, but the slides will be made available to you after the webinar. So don't worry if you don't have time to read everything for now.
Yes. So we now discuss a lot of the direct cost savings for reduced of repairs. But then again, we also identified other values that you could get from remote boiler diagnostics, which of course we're not taking into account in our modeling. So those results would be more favorable even if we added these factors. So another one is around direct revenue increase. So remote boiler diagnostic could also allow a lot of opportunities for kind of changing customer relationship. It could create opportunity for cross-selling and upselling. And also it could really allow the new type of propositions, for instance, that the likes of Feenstra or NG Home Services are providing, where it's a boiler rental or a financing model. And also we could, with the added connectivity, we can see the move towards even more revolutionary propositions like heat as a service, which is often a big hot topic in the industry. So there's clearly these kind of direct revenue streams, but there's also a big part about indirect revenue increases that could come, for instance, through reduced churn and increased customer acquisition. So, for instance, the numbers would change quite significantly if you looked at if remote boiler diagnosis would increase the lifetime of a customer, the average lifetime. So there's loads of factors which are really hard to actually prove unless you go into the market and start experimenting and start innovating in this area, which we are now seeing a lot of more companies doing. So I think in a few years' time, there will be a lot more proof around that there are a lot of other indirect benefits as well.
Okay, and final parts of this. Now we'll we are going to talk a bit more about what we think the future is looking like, specifically around the short or medium term future. So first look at around 2021 and where we see that market going to. So in the study we've just published, we have estimated that over 1.3 million homes are likely to be equipped with remote diagnostics across Europe. And for this 1.2 million, most of them, actually 1.2, will come from the Netherlands and the UK for some of the reasons we have already talked about. A high penetration of boiler servicing, a lot of committed players in these countries, some easiness of doing remote diagnostics versus other countries, etc. So we see these two countries as leading the market going forward. And what we see as well is that the large service providers of maintenance, repair, and installation for boilers will be the ones making the most out of the remote boiler diagnostics market. And the main reason being is that they have the scale to develop solutions. They are already in the market. They are continuously learning about this, and we see them as leading the way for the future. One of the questions our clients asked us a lot is which remote diagnostics tools or platforms will be used the most in the future. And by tool or platform, it's really the company providing the software that will enable whoever is using it to optimize their maintenance and repair of boilers. So if we compare the main three kinds of players, which are large boiler manufacturers, the controls companies, let's say the traditional and the newer ones, and also the large maintenance companies, who is really going to offer these softwares to the end user? For the boiler manufacturers, what's really interesting to look at is what pros and cons or strengths and weaknesses they have. What the boiler manufacturers can really do is to maximize the data and insights from their boiler, because they are the ones with the most data points coming from their boilers. Also, they are really thinking, how am I going to sell my boilers next year? So the market share of boiler sales is really important to them. And what will influence their choices in terms of strategy is primarily going to be this. So if, for example, a large service company is saying, I am not going to sell your boilers anymore if you don't share your data, then it's very likely that the boiler manufacturers will share the data and let the service provider use their own platform in order to provide remote diagnostics. Another point is obviously about helping installers in the best way they can, because installer loyalty is really important to boiler manufacturers in order to help them sell their own boiler brands. It's really hard, the fourth point here is really hard to justify a one brand platform to installers. So if I'm a random installer in the south of Germany today, and I'm installing Viessmann, Bosch, and Vaillant, am I supposed to use the Vaillant platform, the Viessmann platform, and the Bosch platform to use remote diagnostics for the 500 boilers I service every year? It's very unlikely that I'm going to do that. So again, can boiler manufacturers justify using only their brand for installers? It's very unlikely, specifically for small installers. The good thing is sometimes these boiler manufacturers have a large regional or national maintenance company, in which case it's easier to push for their own platforms to this particular business unit of the company. For controls companies, one thing they are really interested in is being brand agnostic. So unlike boiler manufacturers who only work with one brand, they will want to work with as many brands as possible. And either by partnering with boiler manufacturers to get the data, or like we talked about with Tado, getting the data out of the boiler anyway. The difficulty in doing this is how to accurately monitor the boiler data and insights. It is really difficult when not having a full partnership with boiler manufacturers. OpenTherm can be a solution to this, but as we discussed earlier, this is limited right now in terms of how much we can extract from the protocol. And the main strength that these players have is the penetration of smart thermostats. So as we explained, there are possibilities to extract data from smart thermostats. The hardware is already in the home, customers have paid for that, and sometimes this could be the best way to be a starting point for remote boiler diagnostics. Finally, for large maintenance companies, The question that they start with is, should we do it in-house or should we outsource the platform? Some companies like ENGIE, British Gas, Feenstra have decided to actually develop their own platform or have very close partnership with a platform provider like Honeywell and decide to work on this to continuously improve the platform. Like for control companies, these companies are brand agnostics, which means they are often installing, maintaining multiple boiler brands, sometimes up to 5 or 7 even. They also are installing a lot of boilers per year in some countries. So British Gas is the best example in Europe. They are installing over 100,000 boilers a year. So they have some sort of market power over the boiler manufacturers. And if the boiler manufacturers decide to mess with them, they might decide to change their preferred brand. One of the advantages of these companies as well is that they are sometimes owned by a larger group, utility, for example, and utilities are sometimes developing a wider, let's say, home energy management platform, which will include some sort of parts in that platform which could look at boiler diagnostics, looking at integrating APIs from boilers and heat pumps and other sort of technologies might be an easier way than starting a platform from scratch. So these companies also benefit from the bigger corporate platforms being developed.
There's a question around from, do we have insights on kind of multi-boiler brand platforms used for remote diagnostics? And I think this is a really, really timely question on the large maintenance companies. So the one example around Feenstra working with having their own software platform and then basically working with boiler manufacturers to get access to their APIs and extract the data from them. And I think this is where we're seeing a lot of the movement from the large maintenance companies, the industry moving around, maybe starting off working with, handful of boiler brands, but over time, these big maintenance companies, they want to have as much access and kind of control of the data as possible still, and they want wide compatibility because they'll be working with loads of different boiler brands. And probably the easiest way for them to do this is to have their own software platform. It could be developed in partnership with one of these companies on the screen, and then get access to all the different boiler brands through API. So basically just be hoovering all that data to their platform and working from there. And I think this is a kind of the vision for a lot of these large maintenance companies.
And our vision for at least the next 3 years is that the companies on the right-hand side, the large maintenance companies, are likely to be the main platform providers for remote diagnostics, at least as I said, in the next 3 years. We don't see that changing much over time, even in the future, because of the reasons mentioned here. Being brand agnostics is really important. Having the large corporate capabilities to develop a good platform is really important. And some of the other players are perhaps less likely to get the same benefits as large maintenance companies. So we have entered the final Q&A part of the discussion. We have already answered lots of these questions through the webinar, but feel free to continue asking questions. We have one question on what would be the benefits for boiler manufacturers to supply their data over API towards a large maintenance company, such as Feenstra. We can come back to the point here on this slide where a boiler manufacturer, again, is really interested in selling boilers. Primarily, that's the core of their business. And if Feenstra is deciding to include the boiler brand in the rental market they've talked about, then perhaps you are more likely to sell boilers to Feenstra by providing your data and API than you were if you didn't want to do that. So that would be a bit of a market power battle here between maintenance companies, specifically the large ones, and the boiler manufacturers.
Then we have another good question around, okay, we talk a lot about the large maintenance companies because that's really where we see this market being driven from. But how about the smaller companies? Let's say companies with less than 50 installers. I think this is where a big opportunity is for companies in the middle, for the controls companies, the likes of Honeywell and Schneider, if they can develop solutions that might not be, maybe when it comes to data quality or the level of, or the volume of data might not be as cutting edge or as big as some of the boiler OEMs using their own protocols, but the compatibility with several different boiler brands and having one platform they can offer to a maintenance company, let's say with 40 installers, could be a really big opportunity for them. And there's also some markets that would be much better suited for this. So in markets like Germany and Italy, the maintenance companies typically are much smaller in size. So I think there are opportunities for these companies to pursue this segment. So I think it's, of course, the market won't be limited to just the large maintenance companies, but that opportunity will emerge the quickest.
There is a comment saying you can also earn money by selling data via API as a boiler manufacturer. Yes, I mean, there is potentially a negotiation going on between boiler manufacturers and large maintenance companies. From what we can see, the large maintenance companies are absolutely not willing to pay for the data. Their way of thinking is that we are selling your product and we are maintaining your products. We should get all the data from it. So yes, again, you can potentially try to sell your data. Right now, the willingness to pay on the B2B perspective might be limited. This might change over time. This may not. We don't know. This is a big battle in the market. Are boiler manufacturers going to become maintenance providers? It's quite a difficult job to do, actually, to become maintenance providers. You need to have a network of installers dedicated to your brand. So perhaps remote boiler diagnostics could help boiler manufacturers start a business or even acquire regional or national maintenance providers. So this could be, yes, one way to go about this. There are lots of questions, actually. It's really hard to follow everything that's going on, but we are running out of time now. So what I suggest we do is we'll come back to you after the webinar individually to answer the questions. And we might as well put some of the questions answered in the pack of slides after the webinar so that you can have another look at this. Just to conclude here, so here are some of the areas covered in the research we just did, which is available under our Connected Home service. So we looked at the market for connected and connectable boilers. We looked at the differences by country. So we did some deep analysis around this. We did some forecasts on the volumes of remote diagnostics per country and by kind of companies. Some numbers on customer research, etc. Some case studies. So the study is really everything you need to know about remote boiler diagnostics if you need to make decisions in the market in the coming years. Another point to mention, slightly off topic, but is our Nuon Energy Summit, which will be held in Amsterdam on the 28th and 29th of May. The summit will cover a lot of the topics around new energy, but obviously the connected home, and we will also have a panel discussion on the remote boiler diagnostics market with companies such as Intergas, NG Home Services, Tado, sharing their experience at creating solutions for the market. But there will also be other topics discussed, such as the EVs and the relationship between the charge point and the electricity market, flexibility, energy storage, the customer data and customer engagement, etc. So there will be lots of discussions. If you are interested in joining us, please feel free to email us, and we will be delighted to have you there. And I think that's it for us. So I hope that was an interesting discussion. I can still see some questions being fired, so that's great to see. I personally really enjoy looking at this topic. We are continuing to monitor what's happening in the market, so you can expect a lot of noise from us in the future to let you know what are the latest innovations, how are different markets behaving, which companies are emerging and being leading the market, what customers are experiencing with these solutions. We will continue to look into this. So just leaves me to thank you, Evita, thank you, Matti, and thank you all for attending the webinar. And again, this will be made available on YouTube afterwards, and we can send you the slides as well. So thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of the week. Bye-bye.
Bye.